I saw my neighbor in an embarrassing moment on the beach. She said, "I hope you like the view." I never expected that a single morning walk along the shoreline would crack open a chapter of my life I thought had been sealed shut forever. But that is the thing about the ocean. It has a way of pulling secrets to the surface, whether you are ready for them or not. My name is Daniel, and for the past 2 years I had been living the kind of life that looks perfectly fine from the outside. I had a decent job, a quiet apartment, and a neighbor named Claire who I had exchanged maybe 40 words with since she moved in next door. She was polite but distant, reserved but not unfriendly, the kind of person who smiles at you in the hallway and then disappears behind a closed door before you can say anything more. I respected that. I was the same way. After losing my wife, Elena, to illness 3 years ago, I had become fluent in the language of closed doors. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet magic of human connection, please take a moment right now to like this video, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. This community exists because of hearts like yours. That Saturday morning, I had woken up before sunrise because sleep had stopped being my friend a long time ago. I pulled on a jacket and walked the 4 blocks to the beach the way I always did when the weight of silence in my apartment became too heavy to carry. The shore was nearly empty. The sky was that extraordinary shade of violet and amber that only exists in the minutes before the sun fully commits to rising. Waves rolled in soft and steady, like the world was still half asleep and breathing slowly. I was maybe 100 yards down the beach when I saw her. Claire. She was standing at the water's edge, her blonde hair completely wild in the coastal wind, her blue linen shirt billowing open and barely staying on her shoulders. She had clearly not expected anyone to be there. Her shoes were in one hand, her other arm wrapped around herself, and she was standing ankle-deep in the foam, laughing and crying at the same time in that specific broken way that only happens when a person has held something in for far too long. I stopped walking the moment I saw her. I considered turning back. I told myself it was the right thing to do, to give her privacy, to pretend I had seen nothing, to retreat back to my apartment and my silence. But then a wave hit harder than the others and she stumbled, and the shoes flew out of her hand, and she let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and without thinking, I jogged forward and grabbed one of the shoes before it got swallowed by the retreating water. She spun around and saw me. For a moment neither of us spoke. The wind was loud between us. Her face was red from crying and cold from the sea air, and her shirt was completely open now, her arms still crossed over herself, and the look in her eyes was not embarrassment exactly. It was something rawer than that, something exhausted. Then she straightened up, pushed the hair out of her face, and said it with a small, trembling smile that somehow contained both humor and heartbreak. "I hope you like the view." I held out her shoe. She took it, and I said very quietly, "I've seen better days too." Something shifted in her expression, like a lock turning. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she sat down on the wet sand without caring about her clothes, and I sat down beside her without being asked, and we both stared out at the ocean as the sun finished rising. Her story came out slowly, the way things do when someone has been holding them underwater for too long. She had moved to our building after her divorce was finalized. She had been married for 9 years to a man she had loved deeply and then suddenly, devastatingly, could not recognize anymore. The divorce had not been dramatic. No screaming fights, no betrayal, just a long, quiet erosion, like the tide pulling sand from beneath your feet so gradually you don't notice until you are already sinking. She had thought she was handling it well. She had thought she was fine. But that morning she had found a photograph tucked inside an old book, a picture from her wedding day, and something about the light in her own eyes in that photo, so bright and so certain, had broken something open inside her that she hadn't known was still fragile. She had come to the beach because she needed to scream, and she didn't want the walls of her apartment to hold that sound. I understood that more than she knew. I told her about Elena, about the 18 months of hospitals and hope and eventually just hospitals. About how grief doesn't feel the way people tell you it will. It doesn't crash over you like a wave and then recede. It lives in you. It rearranges the furniture inside you in the middle of the night so that you keep stumbling over things in the dark. I told her about the mornings I came to this same beach because the open sky was the only ceiling big enough to hold what I was carrying. She listened the way very few people know how to listen. Completely still, completely present, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually receiving every word. We sat there for almost 2 hours. The beach filled up slowly around us. Joggers passed. A dog investigated our shoes. The sun climbed high and turned the water from gray to blue to gold. At some point, Claire had stopped hugging herself and her hands were resting open in her lap, and I noticed that the tension had left her shoulders and she was breathing differently, deeper, slower, like someone who has finally put down something very heavy. When we finally stood up to leave, she looked at me with clear eyes and said, "I moved here thinking I needed to be alone to heal. I think I had that exactly backwards." I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said better. We walked back up the beach side by side, sandy and damp and slightly ridiculous looking, and when we reached our building and rode the elevator up in comfortable silence, something had fundamentally changed in the air between us. Not romance, not yet, and maybe not ever, and that was not the point. The point was that two people who had each been quietly disappearing had looked at each other across a windswept beach and decided, without words, to stop. Before we reach the end, I want to ask you something. If you have ever felt invisible in your own grief, or laughed when you wanted to cry, or found an unexpected connection in the most unlikely moment, please leave a comment below and tell us your story. Type the words, "I see you," in the comments if this story touched something real inside you. Your words might be exactly what a stranger needs to read today. In the weeks that followed, Claire and I began having coffee in the mornings. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we sat in easy silence with our mugs and the window open to the street sounds below. She started laughing more, a real laugh, unguarded and warm. I started sleeping better. The apartment felt less like a container for grief and more like a home. Neither of us fixed each other. That is not how it works. But we reminded each other that being witnessed, truly seen in your most windswept and unraveling moments, is sometimes all a person needs to start finding their way back to themselves. And it all began on a beach at sunrise, with a lost shoe and 6 words that changed everything. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to be reminded they are not alone, and subscribe to Kindness Corner for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Every share is an act of kindness. Thank you for being here.